There's 2 new locally acquired cases in Melbourne today, and we are getting word from authorities that there's set to be, yes, the lockdown ending on Thursday night. We'll see what form that takes. So much debate, though, around, again, this lockdown, variants in particular, what role they have played and what role they will play in Australia. Joining me live now is Professor Sanjaya Senanayake, who's an Associate Professor of Medicine at the ANU. Thanks for your time. I want to start on variants. The Alpha strain emerged in Britain last year, said to be about 40% more virulent, if you like, than the Wuhan strain. Delta in India a few months later, that's meant to be 50% on top of Alpha. So you're looking at something from the original to Delta that might be twice as infectious. Is that accurate to say? Is it a bit simplistic? What's your view on that?
No, look, that's very reasonable to say. Another way of looking at it, which I've heard one of my colleagues say, which I think is very good, is that if you look at the original strain of COVID, we said it had a reproduction number of 2.5, which meant one person could infect about 2.5 people. The UK strain can infect about 3.75 people, and we're now, or the UK, we should say, the Alpha strain now.
Sure.
Still getting used to it.
So am I.
And the Delta strain can infect about 5 people.
Right.
So this is what they have found in overseas studies where these strains have been predominant.
So it's the same numbers, but what you're putting into perspective here is when you talk about something getting so-called out of control, the number of people that should result from that person, and I know these are sort of averages because a lot of people give it to almost nobody and then some people give it to a whole host, but you take the average, you've gone from 2.5 to 5 out of all the people they come across in life.
That's right. And you mentioned virulence as well, which is how aggressive and how sick an infection can make you. At this stage, it doesn't look like the Delta strain can make someone more sick. It seems to be more infectious, but it doesn't make people more sick. But by virtue of the fact that it can infect a lot more people, you therefore expect to see more sick people just by virtue of the
Sure, right.
people infected.
Complicating that, and I heard you quoted about this or saw you quoted about this today, how the virus actually behaves in different settings. So do we know necessarily that these different strains in Australia behave the same way?
No, we don't. And they are variants of concern. It's something we should be concerned about. But just because this particular strain has behaved in Indian conditions or UK conditions in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it will happen the same way in Australia. And an example of this is the Alpha or the UK strain, Tom. We've had a number of outbreaks or spillovers from hotel quarantine into the community in Australia. But thankfully, due to good public health responses, we've managed to stop those outbreaks before they've taken a foothold and caused a really large outbreak. So in Australia, the UK strain, apart from leaving hotel quarantine, which could be for other reasons, has not caused any major problems compared to earlier strains.
Is it, just to really simplify this for people like myself, is it fair to say when we talk about the R number, you know, how many people you're going to give it to, that when it's at low numbers, when we're talking about a few cases and particularly almost no unlinked cases, that's not as big of a worry. It's when it gets to tens or 100 that has a much bigger impact in terms of whether you have to lock down and restrictions?
Absolutely. And as you correctly said, with one person, they may not transmit it to anyone. Another person might be a super spreader. So really, with small numbers of people, it's very hard to say. It's when you have large numbers of the population infected that you might be more consistent in what you see.
How does this feed into the lockdown we're seeing right now in Victoria? The length of it, your view on how necessary it was from what we've seen so far?
I think not so much just because it was the Delta strain, but the fact that a new strain was identified last week that no one had identified earlier, and the potential of lots of other cases being out there in the community that were who would be infecting other people. I think that was a concern and an important reason to extend that lockdown. But I would hope, on the basis of what we're seeing at the moment, that the lockdown will end at midnight Thursday. If you look at the outbreak this time, Victorian authorities have responded really quite well. We've seen good contact tracing. Most of the people who've become positive have been in quarantine when they've done so. There have only been a small percentage of unlinked cases, so that shows they've been doing a good job. The people of Victoria have responded as well. We've seen 20 to 50,000 people getting tested every day with very tiny percentages of positive tests. So all that's very reassuring.
Does it mean they can be a bit more confident that there's another Delta strain next time, though? Do we know a bit more about how it behaves from this number of cases?
Yeah, I think it would be... You also have to remember there was a case in the community in New South Wales last month as well, and that didn't result in a big outbreak either. So it may well be, if there is another outbreak, the fact that it is the Delta strain shouldn't be the be-all and end-all about deciding what the response is.
I know viruses all have variants, and that's nothing new, but is there anything about COVID that makes it more likely to morph into worse and worse things? Or can there be a point at which it morphs into something more infectious, a variant much more infectious, but almost rarely, if ever, deadly, and that one takes over and it's actually a good thing that it becomes the dominant strain? Is that a possibility?
It is quite possible that we might see a very infectious variant that causes very little serious disease. That is definitely a possibility, because it's, even though we don't think of it as a conscious being, it's not in the virus's interest to kill
people. Yeah.
So it certainly is a possibility. I think what has surprised us is how quickly these variants have emerged.
Compared to others,
Yeah,
right.
so flu normally would be 5 to 10 times, would be mutating 5 to 10 times faster than a coronavirus. So we weren't necessarily expecting to see all these variants at this stage of the outbreak, but I think it just reflects how many infections there have been around the world and how many opportunities there have been for the virus to mutate.
Sanjaya Senanayake, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.